There comes a moment in some men's lives that few people ever notice, but that changes everything. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't look like anger or rebellion. It looks like silence. It looks like a man who has spent years tending to the emotional power grid of everyone around him simply powering down. And the people who depended on him rarely realize that the outage didn't begin today. It began years ago, when he became the one who kept every circuit alive without anyone asking what happens when the generator burns out. Most men watching this carry a quiet illusion they've never put into words. The belief that caring endlessly is what makes them good. That absorbing other people's storms is what keeps relationships intact. But there's a cost to that illusion, and it often shows itself only when the system collapses. This video begins at that moment of collapse, not as pathology, not as weakness, but as the first honest signal that something in him has been overdrawn for far too long. If you look back, you may find an image that fits better than the usual metaphors. Not a well someone can refill, but an ancient cistern, carved by generations, supplying water to families, partners, workplaces, communities, emptied little by people who trusted it would always be full. A vessel no one imagined could run dry. And then one day, when someone lowers the bucket expecting the familiar generosity, the rope hits bottom, and the only response is a hollow echo rising from stone and dust. Many men don't recognize this moment as burnout. They interpret it as personal failure, or worse, moral decline. They think, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel nothing? But this is not the failure of a heart. This is the implosion of an identity that has been stretched beyond what the nervous system can sustain. As Dr. Gabor Mate would remind us, the body always speaks first when the self has been carrying too much for too long. Sleep changes. Affect flattens. There's a chronic heaviness behind the ribs. The mind calls this apathy, but the nervous system calls it a kill switch, a desperate attempt to protect a man from the overload he was never meant to carry alone. There is a hidden contract beneath most overcaring, and many men never notice they signed it. The contract says, if I absorb your storms, if I stay steady while you rage, if I make myself indispensable, you will finally anchor to me. It rarely works. It often comes from early attachment wounds, moments in childhood when stability had to be earned by meeting someone else's emotional needs. And that survival strategy becomes a personality trait. Responsibility becomes identity. Empathy becomes currency. But every contract of overgiving has a shadow, not an evil shadow, but the part of a man that holds all the anger, exhaustion, longing, and unmet needs he never allowed himself to express. When the cistern finally dries, this shadow rises, not with fire, but with a metallic coolness, a faint disdain toward the very requests he used to meet without hesitation. A small, unsettling thought, why is everyone pulling on me? Why can't they carry themselves? Some men fear this shift more than anything. They worry they're turning into the same figures who once wounded them, emotionally distant, unpredictable, unavailable. And yet nothing is actually turning. Something is surfacing. Something that has been buried under years of self-erasure. This early stage often feels less like liberation and more like malfunction. Sleep becomes irregular. The body feels heavy at the wrong moments and restless at the right ones. There's chronic tension across the shoulders, a numbing of emotional color, a sense of looking at life through frosted glass. The empathic bandwidth that once seemed infinite has narrowed to a single thread. And oddly, people may respond with confusion or accusation. You've changed, they say, as if change weren't the inevitable result of being overdrawn for years. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the wounded healer, driven by duty, compassion, and a longing to be needed, begins to morph into the resentful martyr, and then, if nothing shifts, into the frost-bound cold king. A man who still functions, still provides, still shows up, but with the vitality drained from the soul of the gesture. He doesn't stop caring to punish anyone. He stops because caring has become too expensive for a system already in debt. And as we unfold this journey today, I want to name something clearly. When a man stops caring, it is rarely an act of defiance. It is the last protective reflex of an overwhelmed identity. It is not the moment he becomes cold. It is the moment his nervous system begs for mercy. Stay with this, because as we reach the midpoint of this video, we'll uncover a pattern that many men mistake for strength, when it is, in truth, the the nervous system surrendering under the weight of too much responsibility, too much emotional labor, and too little reciprocity. For now, simply notice if any part of this mirrors your experience. Notice if the cistern image touches something wordless in you. You may not have gone emotionally offline out of choice. You may have simply reached the bottom. There is a private economy running inside every overgiving man, and most of it is invisible even to him. It doesn't run on money or skill or talent. It runs on emotional labor, offered freely, quietly, compulsively, and it's built on an equation he never chose, but learned to obey. If you listen closely, the equation sounds like this. If I absorb enough, I'll finally be safe. If I can stay calm while others lose themselves, harmony will return. If I carry the weight, they will stay. This equation rarely begins in adulthood. It usually starts in a childhood where emotional climates shifted without warning. A parent whose mood determined the temperature of the whole house. A sibling who needed protection. A home where the young nervous system had to detect danger before danger arrived. This is where the early radar develops, and with it, an identity. The perceptive one, the reliable one, the one who notices everything so nothing collapses. But beneath that persona sits the part Jung would call the shadow, holding the anger, the loneliness, the desire to be chosen without having to earn it. A man grows up thinking he is simply kind, but the deeper truth is more complex. He learned to erase himself, to preserve connection. There is a moment in many men's lives when they realize that their fear of rejection is not just emotional, it is embodied. The nervous system registers disapproval as threat, not discomfort. This is why chronic appeasing doesn't feel like choice. It feels like survival. Research on threat-biased amygdala responses shows how even subtle tension in another person's tone can override the prefrontal cortex, narrowing a man's perception until he is no longer relating, only preventing rupture. Empathy becomes less an act of presence and more a tactical maneuver, reading microsignals, forecasting outcomes, absorbing atmospheres before they turn volatile, and slowly, something shifts. What once felt like kindness becomes a kind of leverage. Not intentionally, not manipulatively, but inevitably. Buried under years of serving others is an unspoken bargain. If I become indispensable, you won't leave. Many men are startled when they notice this. The generosity they prided themselves on now carries tension. Every favor accumulates a debt no one agreed to pay back. And as Nietzsche noted, denied anger fermented over time doesn't create peace. It creates resentment. A moral posture that protects the one who never learned to protest. If you trace the arc of this internal economy closely, you'll see the small fractures forming long before collapse. Moments when a simple request feels heavier than it should. Moments when someone says, "Can we talk?" And instead of compassion, irritation rises like a pulse he tries to hide. Conversations that once nourished him now drain him. Sleep stops restoring. Even the fantasy life changes. Instead of imagining intimacy or possibility, the mind begins imagining escape, disappearance, distance. Not as drama, but as relief. And then comes the shame. Not shame for what he has done, but shame for having limits at all. Shame for wanting rest. Shame for needing reciprocity. This shame is what keeps the economy running far past its depletion point. Every time he feels exhausted, he compensates by giving more. Hoping the scale will finally balance, hoping someone will finally notice without having to be told. There is a subtle but important shift that follows all this. When the internal economy of overgiving collapses, empathy doesn't disappear. It curdles, it stiffens, it hardens into something almost metallic. And this is where the next chapter begins. The moment when warmth turns into contempt, not because the man has become cruel, but because the cost of caring has exceeded the capacity of his nervous system. When devotion reaches this edge, emotional withdrawal is not a decision. It is the body's last remaining form of truth. There is a particular fatigue that does not show up as anger or collapse, but as a quiet recoil from other people's needs. It begins subtly. A man hears someone venting, or asking, or hinting, and though he still nods, still listens, something inside him whispers a sentence he never imagined he would think. "You will not change, and I am done carrying this." It isn't contempt for the person. It's grief hardened by the realization that endless devotion cannot fix what was never his to solve. Many men misinterpret this moment, assuming it means they have become selfish. In truth, it is the emotional hangover of years spent over-feeling for others while under-feeling for themselves. This is the collapse of the fantasy that caring harder creates loyalty, a quiet shattering of the belief that self-sacrifice guarantees reciprocity. And in that shattering, another internal voice emerges, the one Jung would identify as the shadow finally speaking. The protector who spent years compensating for everyone else now steps back and becomes the skeptic, questioning everything he once offered automatically. This shift does not mean he has lost empathy. It means empathy has reached its threshold and cannot continue without repair. When a man has lived inside a trauma-bonded dynamic, this phase can feel even more disorienting. Many empathic men have been drawn to relationships built on intermittent validation, warmth followed by coldness, idealization followed by withdrawal. These cycles create a kind of psychological dependency, where he becomes addicted not to the person, but to the relief of the good phase returning. He mistakes that relief for intimacy, and when he finally pulls away, the body interprets it as withdrawal. The ache is real. The confusion is real. Contempt, in this context, becomes less a judgment and more a shield, his nervous system's last attempt to prevent relapse into a cycle that has already drained him. There is a cultural image that mirrors this transformation. The healer who, after too many years of tending to others, stops seeing people as individuals and begins seeing categories. The man who once listened deeply now relates through distance. Victim, chaos magnet, emotional opportunist. These labels are not cruelty. They are anesthesia, a way to reduce emotional risk by flattening complexity. It is easier to categorize than to grieve the painful truth that someone is not who he hoped they were. Many clinicians describe this phase not as coldness, but as protective detachment, a narrowing of emotional bandwidth to preserve what little remains. Some men recall a season in their lives when the shift happened suddenly, a period of weeks or months when they went from deeply caring to emotionally sealed. Not hostile, not dramatic, simply unavailable. Friends noticed an edge that had not been there before. Loved ones sensed a distance they could not interpret. And yet, inside the man, it felt less like a decision and more like reaching zero, not having energy, not having capacity, not having any reservoir left to draw from. Life demanded emotional labor he could no longer supply, and the body stopped pretending it could. Across many stories, a similar pattern emerges. Loyalty overextended eventually becomes loyalty withdrawn, often abruptly. A man who once held everyone together suddenly opts out, not because he has turned cold, but because he cannot continue participating in a dynamic that has already exceeded the limits of his nervous system. And here is a quiet truth that many men discover only at this point. Contempt is not the final destination of this journey. It is the midpoint. It is the cramped space between overextension and clarity, between losing oneself and beginning to return. It is a transition state, not a character flaw. In the next chapter, the perspective shifts even deeper, because long before a man consciously decides to pull back, his body has already begun locking the gates. The nervous system quits long before the mind admits it, and the shutdown that follows is often mistaken for strength, stoicism, or maturity, when in reality, it is something far more human. There is a point in every long season of overcaring when the mind still believes it can push forward, but the body quietly refuses. Long before a man admits he is exhausted, his physiology has already staged a mutiny. What looks like emotional distance on the outside is often survival on the inside. The system has reached its threshold, and what once felt like compassionate responsiveness now feels like wading through thick water, each interaction pulling more energy than the body can produce. Clinicians often describe this state as cognitive fatigue and emotional flatness, but most men experience it as something simpler, the volume of life being turned down. This isn't laziness or indifference. The body is reallocating resources, choosing conservation over connection because connection has become too costly. It narrows emotional bandwidth the way a city under stress might shut off non-essential power to keep the grid alive. A man may appear calm, measured, even stoic, but that calm does not come from mastery. It comes from depletion, and yet the world often praises this version of him. mistaking shutdown for strength. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this phase is the freeze response. Many men believe they have become more disciplined because they react less, argue less, or need less from others. But freeze is not discipline. It is immobilization wearing discipline's clothing. It is the nervous system saying, "I cannot fight, I cannot flee, so I will numb." This numbness can feel like peace at first. The sudden reduction in emotional noise can be mistaken for maturity. But beneath this quiet is a stillness that costs him access to the full range of his humanity. A moment arrives, often unexpectedly, when this shutdown reveals itself with astonishing clarity. It can be as ordinary as a phone notification from someone who has historically drained him. His body responds before thought can interfere. If there is tightening followed by immediate engagement, it is the old appeasement reflex, the survival pattern of smoothing conflict before it grows. If there is sudden numbness paired with a desire to withdraw from everything, not just that one person, it is the deeper shutdown, the nervous system taking shelter. But there is another possibility that emerges only after healing has begun, a quiet discernment, free from urgency or collapse, allowing him to choose his level of engagement without losing himself. This stage carries an archetypal weight. Across myths and psychological traditions, there is a figure who begins as the wounded healer, overflowing with care, driven by duty, and ends as the stone king when the wounds go unacknowledged. The heart calcifies not out of malice, but out of necessity. He becomes efficient, yet uninhabited, present, but unreachable. On the outside, this may look like strength. On the inside, it feels like living behind a sealed door.
When a man says, "I don't care anymore," the deeper truth is often this: I cannot afford to feel what caring requires. And this is where many men stop the story too early. They assume the freeze is the final form, the mature boundary, the proof that they have grown past their old patterns. But the freeze is not the endpoint. It is the midpoint. It is the temporary fortress built to survive a flood, not the home meant to be lived in.
2 chapters ahead, this freeze state will reveal itself through patterns shared across thousands of survivors, patterns that distinguish shutdown from genuine boundaries and emotional exhaustion from intentional sovereignty. For now, it is enough to recognize that the gates did not close out of rejection. They closed because the cost of openness exceeded the body's capacity to remain whole. There is a phase in the collapse of overgiving when something unexpected happens. The warmth that once guided a man's interactions has already dimmed. The nervous system has retreated into protection. And now, another force begins to rise. It is not cruelty, and it is not malice. It is the shadow, the part of him that held every unspoken need, every silenced frustration, every unclaimed piece of authority, finally stepping forward after years of being pushed aside. When empathy goes offline, this shadow does not come with softness. It comes with precision, with strategy, with an instinct to reclaim ground that has been surrendered for too long. A man who once responded instinctively with care may now find himself thinking 2 steps ahead, not to nurture connection, but to maintain distance. This is the archetypal reversal. The protector becomes the tactician. He begins to mirror tactics he once endured without meaning to, using silence instead of explanation, withholding instead of engaging, retreating not to preserve connection, but to maintain superiority in the interaction. It is a subtle drift toward power as a defensive posture. And while it may look controlled from the outside, it is simply the psyche protecting itself with the only tools left available. For some men, this shift feels almost intoxicating. After years of transparency, emotional opacity can feel like armor. Being unreadable offers a kind of safety that empathy never provided. Detachment becomes a way to avoid being vulnerable, and emotional distance becomes a way to prevent being drained again. But the deeper truth is less triumphant. This is not strategy. It is retaliation against the cost of caring. The coldness is not earned authority. It is scarcity, wrapped in the appearance of composure. Many men discover something even more unsettling during this phase. After leaving a toxic dynamic or a cycle of intermittent validation, they begin to notice themselves behaving in ways that echo their former partners or environments. Indifference slips into interactions that do not deserve it. Dismissiveness appears where kindness once lived. A quiet cruelty emerges not from intention, but from dysregulation. And then the thought arrives, have I become what I escaped? This moment is often the most confronting. Yet it does not mean he is turning into someone harmful. It means the nervous system is still operating under the logic of survival, not connection. In this state, purpose begins to erode. The mission that once anchored him becomes hazy. Work becomes a refuge rather than a channel for meaning. Relationships shift from bonds of presence to games of distance. Even the drive towards self-mastery weakens, replaced by distraction disguised as discipline. Nietzsche warned that the abyss a man studies eventually begins to study him. In this context, the abyss is not darkness itself, but the unintegrated shadow leading the way. A man may believe he has evolved beyond emotional overextension, but he has only swung to its opposite extreme. This is not the end of his development. It is a liminal space, the threshold between collapse and reconstruction. The coldness is not a destination. It is what happens when a man has not yet learned to direct his care toward what aligns with his values rather than what demands his attention. The path forward does not require him to care less, but to care selectively, to reclaim the ability to choose where his emotional energy flows. And that is where the next chapter turns. Because when a man stops performing goodness and begins practicing value-guided engagement, something shifts. Caring becomes precise rather than indiscriminate. Boundaries change shape. And the self that once felt depleted begins to return. There is a subtle but profound transformation that occurs when a man begins to step out of the pattern of indiscriminate overcaring. It does not happen as a declaration or a dramatic rupture. It begins quietly, with the recognition that the lifelong role of emotional custodian is no longer sustainable. The impulse to absorb every storm diminishes not because empathy is gone, but because the nervous system has begun to assert its own limits. A man stops smoothing conflicts reflexively, stops absorbing chaos automatically, and begins to notice the space between instinct and choice. This is not isolation. It is the first breath of selective engagement. The internal law that emerges during this period is simple, yet profound. The nervous system sets the perimeter. A man begins to ask a question that previously felt impossible. Can my system afford this today? The weight of old contracts, of absorbed obligations, is measured against current capacity. Chronic research on people-pleasing and emotional overextension reveals the physical toll. Adrenal exhaustion, disrupted sleep, flattened affect. When a man aligns his choices with his capacity, he is not retreating from humanity. He is stewarding the life force that allows connection to be sustainable rather than destructive. In this space, a new archetype quietly emerges. The warrior king, or disciplined guardian, is no longer defined by sacrificial giving, but by precise allocation. Care is no longer a leak, it is a resource. Investment is deep but selective, toward mission, toward body, toward a chosen inner circle. Minimal engagement is offered to chronic irresponsibility, distraction, and emotional volatility. Presence is intentional, not reflexive. Compassion is exercised with boundaries, and empathy is no longer indistinguishable from exhaustion. This selectivity becomes visible in subtle ways. A man may say no concisely, without over-explaining or apologizing, tolerating disappointment without guilt. He may witness another's crisis without internalizing it, observing instead of carrying. His outreach becomes intentional rather than automatic, a signal that he is present, but not at the cost of himself. The difference between reactive overgiving and this deliberate engagement is not obvious to the world, but it is experienced deeply within the nervous system. There is a sense of balance, of sovereignty, and of alignment that was previously absent, and the language a man uses begins to shift. The phrase "I don't care anymore" evolves into something more precise. I no longer carry what isn't mine. There is no moral judgment, no condemnation of others. Just clarity, just recognition that emotional energy is finite, and that care directed toward what aligns with values produces meaning and strength, while care directed toward obligation or compulsion produces exhaustion and shadow. In this state, boundaries are not walls. They are gates that preserve the capacity to engage deeply, fully, and sustainably with life. This is the culmination of a long arc: collapse, shadow, freeze, and now principled engagement. The body has signaled, the mind has learned, and the man has begun to choose. What once was unconscious survival strategy is now conscious stewardship. What once was overextension is now selective integrity. And in this careful, measured way, a man begins to reclaim the vitality, presence, and sense of purpose that overcaring had long obscured. When a man reaches the point of emotional shutdown, it often feels like the end of the story. He may believe he has become indifferent, cold, or beyond repair. Yet beneath this surface lies a deeper truth. What appeared as the collapse of care is often the first step toward precision, sovereignty, and alignment. The nervous system that once screamed in exhaustion is now quietly signaling where energy can and cannot go. The man is not done with empathy. He is learning to direct it intentionally. The arc of this transformation can be seen through archetypal imagery. The wounded healer, who gave without pause, moves through the Stone King, who functions efficiently, yet remains emotionally distant, and finally emerges as the disciplined guardian. The disciplined guardian cares with awareness, not obligation, with boundaries, not guilt, and with values guiding attention rather than compulsion. This is the evolution from unconscious sacrifice to sovereign discernment, from depletion to stewardship. One way to understand this is through the image of a lighthouse. Once, the lighthouse keeper tried to keep every ship safe, lighting every path indiscriminately. Exhaustion set in, the beacon dimmed. But over time, he rebuilds the light, smaller, stronger, more precise. Now the light reaches only those who respect the coastline, those who navigate with care and attention. The keeper has not stopped caring. He has learned to care with clarity, integrity, and sustainability. The ultimate realization often comes softly. It was never that the man cared too much, but that he cared indiscriminately. Empathy, when used as armor rather than direction, becomes a drain. When guided by values, it becomes a tool of presence and discernment. And in that recognition, the man begins to inhabit himself fully, unburdened by the obligations of the past, free to invest where it matters most. If any part of this resonates, there is a quiet invitation in the experience itself. One line, one observation, one small recognition that signals you have stopped carrying what is not yours can serve as a guidepost. In sharing it, you might provide another man with a mirror, a point of orientation in his own journey from exhaustion to selective, value-aligned care. This is the final stage of the arc, not indifference, not detachment, but conscious, intentional engagement. A man has moved from being everyone's caretaker to being the steward of his own energy, his own life, and his own purpose. He has learned that caring is not the problem, caring without discernment is. And in that discernment, true freedom and sovereignty quietly emerge.